This week on the Communicators, a discussion about updating U.S. communications policy with Tom Tauke, Executive Vice President at Verizon.
Tom Tauke, in a recent speech to the New Democrat Network, you compared telecommunications law and telecommunications regulation to the Winchester Mystery House, a house that grew up over years and has hallways that go nowhere, doorways that don't open. How do you update telecommunications law in such a dynamic and ever-changing field?
It is true that our telecommunications law needs updating, and in part it is because it's growing up over time. Lots of amendments here and additions there that have built this structure that is now the framework that governs our industry. But it hasn't really changed to reflect the new world of communications. So this law was essentially constructed at a time when you had monopolies in the cable industry and the telephone industry and essentially broadcast monopolies in the local community. And it was constructed as a siloed set of industries. And of course, all of that has changed. The internet and technology have changed this so that now you have everybody in everybody else's business, so to speak. You can't address these industries in silos anymore. And the whole nature of the development of content, with users actually developing the content rather than just being receivers of content, all of that has changed the dynamic of the industry so significantly that it's time to take a new look at the statute.
Do you think that the 1996 telecom law is even out of date and that needs to be updated as well?
But when you think about it, the driving force behind the 1996 Act was allowing local telephone companies to get into the long-distance business. You know, we don't even think about distance anymore. You know, it's anytime, anywhere, any place, and the notion of differentiating between a local call, an in-state call, a long-distance call, that's been blown away. So if you talk about that to a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old, they look at you strangely. You got to be my age to remember what it was like when you had all of these different calling structures.
Who takes the lead? The FCC? Is Congress ready to develop a framework?
I think that Congress needs to take the lead, and that's in part why I did talk about this issue, because the Federal Communications Commission really is facing a tough task. The chairman of the FCC, Chairman Janikowski, has been charged by his boss, the president, and the administration with trying to implement new policies. They just came out with a national broadband plan, trying to look at all of the challenges that we face as a nation and how broadband can address some of those challenges. They see this as a vital infrastructure, which is right. They're trying to encourage investment. They want innovation in the space. So all this is good, but they're trying to work with a statute that isn't structured for this area. And I think that when we look at this world of the internet, we know that we don't want it to be a wild, wild west. We want it to be governed by a rule of law. And Congress really has to determine what are the principles for that rule of law and who has the power to enforce and oversee.
We're talking this week on the Communicators with Tom Tauke, who is the Executive Vice President for Policy of Verizon. Joining us is Kim Hart of the Hill newspaper. She's a technology reporter, and she also writes the Silicon Valley column.
Hi, how are you, Tom?
It's fine, Kim.
Last week in your speech, you talked a lot about how everyone is kind of playing in each other's sandboxes these days.
Right.
Computer companies are selling cell phones, and network providers are having their own app stores now. And you stressed a lot about the need for the government to ensure that no player in the ecosystem has an advantage over another, and that you wanted a really technology agnostic kind of policy going forward. What do you think is the best way to approach that, since you've just said that you do think that some updates are needed to the law? Are there specific updates that you see needed to make sure that we're keeping up with all these changes?
Well, first of all, we haven't come up with all the answers ourselves, and certainly there are going to be many people who have different ideas, and part of the effort here was to get a conversation going, to really encourage people to come forward with their ideas and discuss how legislation might be put together. And I want to say I'm a former member of Congress, not current, so it's not my job to do this, but I do think that there are many capable people on the Hill who are going to have good ideas about how to address some of these issues. So with that said, let me just say, I think that in essence, what we need to do is to approach this from the perspective of the consumer. So one of the examples I used was behavioral advertising, for example. And behavioral advertising, for those who may not know, I think was very well described by Senator Byron Dorgan when he said, if I go into a store and the clerk is keeping track what I buy in that store, I feel fine with that. But if I go to a mall and somebody started following me around from store to see what I was buying in order to keep track of that and then send advertising to me, I'd feel very uneasy about it. And that's what happens on the internet, is you have various players who can keep track of you as you go on the internet and compile that information and then direct advertising to you. Now, our perspective is that generally consumers should not be tracked on the internet unless they give their affirmative permission to be tracked. And that should apply to anybody who would track. It should apply to the internet service provider, it would apply to the search engine, it would apply to anybody who would be attracting your behavior on the internet. And I think it's a little bit like if you walk into a grocery store today. You can give permission for them to keep track of what you buy and you join the club and you get a discount, or you can deny that permission. And that's the same thing that we should have on the internet, that same kind of rule, but it should apply to everybody. So if the consumer says, no, I don't want to be tracked, that applies to all the players, not to one. And you shouldn't have a situation where you have to do this method to get this player not to track and another method to have another player not to track. So I think looking at it from a consumer perspective, you want to make sure that it's easy for the consumer, that the consumer feels secure and safe, and that the same rules apply for all the people who might be doing or participating in some way in the consumer experience on the internet.
And do you see, a lot of players in the industry, especially in the advertising world, have really kind of advocated for a self-regulatory?
I would advocate in some ways for a self-regulatory process because this is such a fast-moving world that generally government doesn't move that fast, to be blunt. Government isn't designed to move quickly. And so to the extent you can have industry self-governance, that could work very well. The advertising industry actually is a good example of that. The advertising industry is in large part a self-governing industry, but it has the Federal Trade Commission overseeing it and the Federal Trade Commission stepping in where the industry isn't able to handle an issue themselves. And so I think that is not a bad model, at least for a lot of things that might go on the internet, at least at this time in our history when things are moving quickly and we have a lot of new experiences and new technology being put out there.
Mr. Tauke, the broadband plan released by the FCC recently, there seemed to be general across-the-board support. Is Verizon a full supporter of the broadband plan?
There is so much in the broadband plan that to say a full supporter probably would get me in some trouble with somebody. But I think generally there are a lot of very good things in the broadband plan, and I want to single out the very good work that the team that put that plan together did. They had a limited amount of time, and they came up with a very credible document based on a lot of research. We think that there are things in there like the call to begin work on freeing up spectrum in order to meet future mobile communications needs right on target. Some of the efforts to try to restructure the high-cost fund and universal service to ensure that it's going to bring broadband to rural areas, generally very much on target, I think. The efforts to focus on adoption, the efforts to get the federal government to play a role as they purchase services in driving broadband adoption and using broadband in order to deliver services to constituents. I mean, I think all of these things are very good. There are some aspects of it that cause us a little bit of pause, but that happens when you have a 360-page document.
Such as?
Well, I would say some of this is in some of the questions raised about regulation. We generally are of the view that the policy that the federal government adopted during the Clinton administration and has essentially followed since then, which is that the government gives the really light regulatory touch to the internet and has espoused that policy around the world, that is the right policy. And while this plan doesn't recommend a change from it, it raises the question about whether or not there should be a change from that policy. And then there are other specific issues. Well, I'll just pick one, copper retirement, which is close to us. I mean, we've been deploying fiber. When you replace the copper with fiber, you want to pull the copper out at some point because you don't want to run two networks, you want to run one. That's part of the business case for putting in the fiber. If you would be required to maintain the copper, then your ability to deploy fiber is diminished because you can't afford to maintain two networks. So I think that when that kind of issue is raised, which had not been on the table from our perspective before, then that causes us some concern about where this might be headed. So in any comprehensive review of issues, there are some you like and there are some that you have concerns about, and that would be the case here. But overall, I think that the FCC deserves a commendation for its work.
Verizon's CEO and Google CEO
Right.
co-wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today,
Right.
talking about some of the points of agreement that both companies see within the broadband plan.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the points that you guys are eye to eye on, and then maybe we can get into some of the things that maybe you aren't so eye to eye on?
There's a little bit of history here that I might just recount. We have been trying for about 2 years to try to bridge some of the gaps between some of the players in the internet space. We've had some, policy disputes here in Washington. And my own experience is that if you can find a way to bridge some gaps, you can help the policy process a little bit. And to the extent we can, we'd like to help the policy process develop appropriately for this internet ecosystem. I think it's fair to say that one of the areas of policy dispute has been net neutrality. And Verizon has been on one side saying we really don't see net neutrality as it's defined by some of the proposals at the FCC to be a good thing. Google has been a strong advocate of this policy. And so we have been working with Google to try to see if we can bridge that gap. So we did a filing, we did a blog several months ago, we did a filing at the FCC in the net neutrality proceeding, in which in both of those we outlined some areas of agreement. And now this op-ed is another attempt to try to continue to bridge gaps. I think what, in essence, I'd say that what we, I think, generally agree on is that the policy of the light regulatory touch, if you will, is probably the right policy going forward for the government. I think we also agree, however, that you need a structure here, a policy structure that works, because we both consider our companies to be good actors in the space, doing a lot of good things. We also know that bad actors can make it can chill consumer behavior in the space, and that wouldn't be good for anybody. So you do want government oversight in order to ensure that bad actors are disciplined in the space. Then the question is, how do you do that? I think that I would say there are two key things that we have reached, I think, a common understanding on. One is the test for government intervention. The government should step in when there is harm to consumers or users in the space, if there's some harm, or if there's anti-competitive activity. So if somebody's doing something that harms the consumers or is anti-competitive, that's reason for government to step in. The other thing that we have focused a lot on is process. And we have been working on a process for self-governance in the industry to the extent that's feasible, but also a mechanism for when disputes go to government, a government entity like the FCC or the FTC, that there's a workable process that gives you a quick answer. And so we're looking at, instead of having a system like we do today at the Federal Communications Commission, where the FCC makes rules in anticipation of what might occur, we think, well, it's very hard to anticipate this market, especially several years in advance. So isn't it better off to have a system where when an issue comes forward, the FCC has that issue brought to it, it makes a quick decision based on the facts of that case, and in the course of making those decisions is fleshing out the policy for the space. So I think we're looking at both the test and the process as key to coming to some common understanding of something that would work for our industry.
And you mentioned the FCC, and kind of in last week in your speech, you said you wanted a more flexible, adaptive oversight of this industry that is changing so quickly
Right.
every day. Some have said that that's kind of advocating taking some of the FCC's teeth away, kind of taking a little bit of the rulemaking power and enforcement power that you kind of see it taking more of a FTC-like role of having kind of enforcement power, but not as much rulemaking power. How do you
Well,
weigh the two?
I don't think it's taking the teeth away at all. That
Okay.
clearly isn't the intent. I think it's using the power of government in as smart a way as possible while attempting to achieve the objective of having innovation, quick innovation in the space, the development of lots of new products and services, and having a quick moving market. So if you have those things, you can't have a cumbersome regulatory process. You need an agile regulatory process. And so I think that what we're saying is the FCC should set out guidelines, or maybe the Congress should in statute, but somewhere we need principles laid out, the guidelines laid out, test for government intervention, as I alluded to, and then start moving on these things quickly. I would say to you that if you have a process where it takes years to get an answer, and you're bogged down in the courts, which is what is threatening our industry right now, that's not a good answer for anybody, and it certainly doesn't make the agency effective in the marketplace. What we want is whatever the agency is that has this jurisdiction, whether the FCC or the FTC, that they move promptly, that they are able to make decisions quickly, and in that way shape the marketplace rather than having everything ending up in the courts.
Tom Tauke, if you could just reconcile a couple of things.
Sure.
In your speech and in a lot of Verizon blog filings, you're always talking about the investment that's been made and the number of people who have access to the internet, 95% of Americans, et cetera, things like this. And then you talk about a light regulatory touch. And then at the same time, there's discussion here in the op-ed by Eric Schmidt and Ivan Seidenberg saying that you need private investment and partnership between governments and private companies. And then in your recent speech, you talked about perhaps subsidies for broadband a la food stamps. Could you reconcile those?
Sure.
That was a lot of questions. Sorry about that.
Let's start by saying that the investment in this space is huge. I mean, our company alone has been investing at the rate of $17 billion a year for the last several years. And when you look at that in contrast to all other American companies, it's much greater than any other American company but AT&T. A few years we've been ahead, a few years they've been ahead. But our two companies and the rest of the industry, the cable industry and others, are investing huge amounts of money in infrastructure. This investment, the FCC in its broadband plan estimated an investment of up to $350 billion needed over the next several years to get our infrastructure to improve, to match the services and the demands that will come from the marketplace. So you have to have a climate which encourages and permits that investment. Okay? Part of creating that climate is having a government policy that makes sense. So you want a policy that ensures that consumers feel comfortable in the space, because that's part of encouraging investment. You also want a policy, however, that moves with the marketplace and the technology, which is what I was trying to describe earlier. I think there are other things government can do. There are little things, like when the state of Virginia had put its driver's license process online, this was a great thing. You didn't have to go to the DMV to stand in line anymore. Right, you can go. City of Alexandria, where I happen to live, though I spend most of my time working in New Jersey and New York, but you can go online and you can see all of your property tax things for your car and home and all of these things. It's terrific. It just makes doing business with the government so much easier. Government, in a sense, can encourage adoption by doing those things, by using the tools that are available. The broadband plan focuses on that. Using broadband in education, using broadband to conserve energy, using broadband to make our transportation system smarter, using broadband in order to improve the delivery of healthcare services. So government's role in encouraging the use of this technology, and frankly, updating government, is a terrific thing. The other place, I think, where government has a role to play is if the private sector, with all of its investment, is not reaching some citizens, there is a role for government to play to try to make sure that those citizens are reached. I don't think anybody suggests it's wise to keep them out of the system, or offline, so to speak. We don't want a digital divide, as some have suggested. And traditionally, we've done that in communications. We've had a universal service fund to support universal telephony, and I think this is the same kind of thing. So I believe that government's role is to create the climate for investment, to ensure that everybody is engaged, to promote the use of the technology as much as possible so that people adopt the technology and their lives are enhanced by it.
Along the model of using kind of a different model for maybe subsidies for this technology, like along the lines of a fuel or a food stamp type model. Can you elaborate how you might see that happening? That was an idea
Sure.
that hasn't been talked about a lot.
Yeah, I think the one of the things that I suppose is an example of what government should not do. Okay? Government, in creating the right climate, should not be picking winners and losers. So if you look at the fuel industry or the for home heating or food stamps, you don't have the government and the home heating industry saying to companies, well, you collect money and then we will distribute money to the companies and they will provide the services to the consumers. Instead, the government collects money from the general tax base, gives money to those consumers who need it to purchase fuel, and then the consumer decides if they're going to buy natural gas, home heating oil, electricity or whatever. But the government doesn't get into the business of directing money to companies and then telling the companies how they're going to deliver the service. And if it did, it would mess up, I suspect, the delivery of heating to the people who need it. Similarly with food stamps, you don't have government coming in and sending money to the grocery store, the food manufacturer, to then provide food to consumers. Instead, you have the government sending money to the consumer so they can go to the grocery store and buy food like everybody else. My belief is that if the government tried to send the money to the grocery store or the food manufacturer, we'd mess up the food distribution system. So when it comes to broadband, my only point is this. We have had a world where there was one telephone company in an area, so you'd send the money to the telephone company and the company would then provide the service to the consumer. That's not the model for the industry we have today. Instead, we have many companies that are providing broadband services to consumers, and the consumers who need the assistance should receive the funds and purchase it from the company they choose, a satellite company, a cable company, a telephone company, whatever. But don't, have the government picking the winners and losers in the marketplace or controlling the marketplace through the distribution of subsidies. So subsidies to consumers, not to companies.
Tom Tauke is the Executive Vice President of Verizon. Kim Hart is a technology reporter with The Hill. Next question.
Wanted to talk a little bit more about Title I versus Title II. This was something that is always quite explosive these days.
Now we're getting down into the weeds.
Well, of course, we're all waiting on a Comcast court ruling.
Right.
The FCC now classifies broadband as Title I, an information service. Comcast has challenged their authority to regulate that service under that classification, which is why it's in court. And depending on what the court comes back with, the FCC has indicated it is open to considering reclassifying broadband altogether as a communication service under Title II. You indicated in your speech last week that you don't think that that is a wise idea, both because the FCC doesn't necessarily have jurisdiction to do that, and also because the current broadband industry just doesn't fit into the Title II framework. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking on what will happen if the FCC does go forward with that thought?
Probably saying that I think it's an unwise idea to classify broadband as Title II would be an understatement. The Title II law was a great law for the industry that existed in 1934, the telephone industry that was a monopoly industry. But it includes excruciating regulation of the industry, from the kinds of patches that the workers wear on their uniforms to how many times the phone rings before it's answered. I mean, it just is a very extensive regulation of the industry. And it is, I think, horribly ill-suited for the industry that we have today, the communication sector that we have today. And I think that if the FCC would try to, in a sense, shoehorn this industry into the Title II section of the law and apply that to the industry, that we would end up with years of court battles. And this is in part what wouldn't be good for anybody. So that's in part why I think it's time for Congress to step in. I mean, the FCC, I don't want to speak for the FCC, but as an observer of the Federal Communications Commission, I'd say they'd only be doing this out of desperation, because the court would be telling them, well, you have classified broadband as Title I, now that doesn't work. So they'd say, well, let's try Title II, because there isn't any other title which really fits. So they're doing it because they don't have any place else to turn. This is when Congress is supposed to act. We don't have a segment of the communication statute that really applies or works for this segment of the industry. Congress simply needs to update the law, so to speak.
Would classifying it as Title II, would it cover companies like Google?
Well, no, it would only cover a segment of players in the industry, those essentially who have networks and certain kinds of networks. Google has an extensive nationwide network that connects all of its servers and all of its storage capability, but it doesn't have the kind of network that would be regulated under Title II. So it creates, I think from the consumer perspective, it would not work. And from a legal perspective, it would result in a lot of dispute. And so it wouldn't be a good thing, I think, for the growth of the industry, of the achievement of the objectives of the National Broadband
So
Plan.
it would cover the Comcasts and,
Yeah,
the,
we cover,
and the
well,
Verizons.
you know, it's interesting. Comcast thinks they're under Title VI, which is for cable companies. Wireless is under Title III. Verizon, when it's a telephone, acting as a telephone company, is under Title II. But theoretically, yes, Comcast would be put under Title II, which would really be interesting to watch that happen. I mean, this is all kind of inside baseball and down in the weeds, so to speak, but it does have profound impact on the consumer experience. So going back to the consumer, if the consumer should have some kind of sense of certainty in the space, not have to worry about which company at the moment is doing which thing, but just what is my experience and do I have a good experience in the space, I don't think this would work very well for the consumer.
Well, as a longtime Washington hand, do you see any movement in Congress, or do you see the FCC leaning towards considering all these companies to be equal partners in a sense?
I think the FCC is constrained, I might even say hamstrung, by the statute under which they operate. I mean, they have a certain amount of flexibility, but in essence what's happening potentially with the court decisions is that their flexibility is being constrained. Okay, that's in part why I think it's important for Congress to act. There are a lot of members of Congress who believe they ought to act. Congressman Boucher, who's chair of the Telecom Subcommittee, issued a statement. I don't want to speak for him, but I think said we need to have a comprehensive look at the law. Several other members of Congress said similar things, and I think there is a general recognition that from time to time, when you have an industry as dynamic and it's changing as this industry is. I mean, in '96, remember, who ever thought of a search engine? You know, what was Google? And then, I mean, this is a whole different world today. Wireless, downloading video on your wireless phone. I mean, most people didn't have any wireless phones. To think that since what was written in '96 would apply to today's industry, I think most people would say, yeah, probably you need to update the law.
You've also said that you see along those lines that the power is kind of shifting to the cloud.
Yes.
How do you see Verizon playing a role in that, or what is Verizon's place in this new cloud ecosystem that we're living in?
But first, let me take a moment to try to explain, if I can, what is the cloud. Here's what's happening in the world that we live in today. So I have a wireless phone, I have a TV, I have a computer, and I might have them in different places. I happen to I have 3 different offices, New York, New Jersey, and DC. I have 2 homes that I have. But I want to be able to access all of my information anytime, any place, and whatever screen I'd like. And we're moving to that world. So how does that happen? Well, what happens is instead of having your information stored in your device, like your PC at home or your information stored in the in your mobile phone. Instead, you are storing that information in the cloud. So instead of just having your pictures on the PC, the pictures go on the cloud. Then you can see your pictures on the TV screen. You can see your pictures on your mobile phone. You can see the pictures on the computer when you're in another city or at another office. So you can access your information from any place because the information is in the cloud. We call this cloud computing. That cloud computing could be in Google's server, it could be in Verizon's server, it could be in various places. I think I'm using the right technology or the right terminology here. And in essence, what I was saying is that the power now is going to move away from the person who maybe has the wire to your house that you use, or who has the cell phone tower that you may be using at the moment. And the power is going to be with the company that is storing that information for you, with whom you've entrusted with your information. And that's changing dramatically in a sense, the shape of the industry as I see it.
And finally, Mr. Tauke, this is a little out of your area, but I just wanted to see if we could get a read from you on Verizon getting an iPhone. According to this article in the Wall Street Journal, recent article, there's a movement at Apple to develop an iPhone that uses Verizon technology.
Well, I'm not permitted to make any news here today on that subject. I would just observe that we believe we have the best network, best wireless network, and I think there's, we get a lot of recognition for that. And I think there are a lot of people, if they could have their favorite device on the best network, would think this was a real winner.
And one more very quick item from the newspaper. In a recent FCC ruling granting some wireless provisions to a company, in the ruling, the FCC said that you must check with us first before contracting with the largest or the second largest wireless company. Correct. What is that about?
Well, we're trying to figure out what this is about, actually. This is a merger between a satellite company and a venture capital company. The venture capital company agreed to some conditions at the FCC. But and these conditions now we find out, which came out on Friday, these conditions apply to us or have impact on us. Just from a process perspective, this is kind of troubling because we had no access to any of the discussions that were going on at the FCC. There was no transparency. All these filings were confidential. And so all of a sudden we find out that these two entities agreed to conditions that have impact on us, and we say, this doesn't seem like a fair process. The other factor that is of concern then is that what kind of precedent this sets if that is permitted to happen in this case. Because while this specific case may not be earth-shattering in terms of the impact on the industry, the precedent could be fairly troubling down the road. So that's why we're taking a hard look at it, but we are still assessing.
Tom Tauke of Verizon, Kim Hart of The Hill, thank you both.
Thank you.